Up next is Eugenie Sage. She has been a Green MP since 2011. She chairs Parliament's Environment Select Committee and was Minister of Conservation, Minister for Land Information and Associate Environment Minister from October 2017 to 2020. And she's the Green spokesperson for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, Conservation, Forestry, Land Information, Emergency Management and Three Waters. What do you do on Tuesdays? I mean, clearly that's not much you're up to. Round of applause, please, for Eugenie.
Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, kia ranganui rawako papatūnuku tēnā korua. Ki ngā tini mate, kua haere ki te pō. Ki te whare e tēnei tēnā koe. E ngā mana whenua, ngā tuahuriri, tēnā koutou. Kia koutou ngā rangatahi, e hui mai nei rā ka mihi, kia koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, kia ora. I'm really pleased to be talking, I think, having had a lot of science yesterday and now art from Vana, and that intersection really of science, not so much art, but politics, and the ability of people to influence change through influencing our political system. And I'd like to acknowledge Jocelyn Papril at the back, another sustainability educator who does a lot to empower young people to be able to influence change. And I'm really looking forward to Riley and Steve's talk later this afternoon. But as Tim said, have been a politician for a while, and I thought I'd go quite quickly through some of the oceans issues and just the way in which people have influenced our governments to make change. 70% of our planet is ocean. We are a blue planet. And Aotearoa New Zealand's marine environment is 15 times the size of our land. So it's important that we look after it now and for future generations. And as you will have seen on Sumner Beach, and congratulations for going out and doing that practical work to help our oceans by picking up waste, which otherwise ends in the ocean and can be eaten by seabirds, marine mammals and fish. When you're standing on the beach, looking out to sea, for me, that's enormously reassuring because mostly you don't see any human structures. You can't see beyond the horizon. So it's this immense place. It's this wild place. One of the things, though, is that a lot of what goes on out there isn't seen, so people don't get angry about it and don't take action. Overfishing, for example, happens out of sight, and for a lot of people, it's out of mind. The oceans provide 70% of the oxygen we breathe, they regulate our climate, and they are a major source of food and medicines. They've also protected us from the worst of climate change by absorbing 90% of the heat from a changing and warming climate. We need to take better care of our oceans to protect them and to protect ourselves. Why do we value nature in Aotearoa? Well, many reasons. The species that we share these islands with, and you probably will have heard yesterday that the species on Aotearoa and in our waters evolved over 80 million years as Aotearoa was separated from the giant supercontinent of Gondwana. So we've got a lot of endemic species here in Aotearoa that are only found here in these islands. So we've got an international responsibility to look after them. So they have a value in and of themselves. They also, nature provides us with clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, soil to grow food. So it's got these values that people call ecosystem services. These species are fundamental to our identity as New Zealanders and to Māori in terms of the whole Te Ao Māori perspective. Nature is a place to recreate and recreate and re-energise ourselves. So healthy nature is essential to our well-being as humans, and our economy is a subset of nature, not the other way around. But here in Aotearoa, we're not doing so well, partly because we've got so many endemic species, and when humans colonised Aotearoa, we brought with us rats, stoats, hedgehogs, possums, all of these predators, which when combined with our destruction of habitats on land has led to 4,000 species being classified as rare or endangered. They're in trouble. We've made more than 50 bird species extinct, and the major culprits on land are possum, rats and stoats. Some of the ways we use land have had a major impact on our oceans. The clearance of forest leading to a lot of sediment in estuaries, impacting on the ability of estuaries to support nursery grounds for fish, a lot of loss of sand dunes, the buffer that they provide, the breeding habitats that they provide for a lot of our shorebird species. With a lot more nutrients ending up in rivers, that ends up in the sea, that's an issue as well. So we rely on nature in New Zealand for our primary industries, food and fibre, all the meat, wool products that we export. We rely on nature for tourism. So we need to use land better so that it better protects our oceans. And one example of that was where marine farmers in Golden Bay talked to the dairy farmers in the Aorere catchment, because a lot of the runoff from the dairy cows was ending up in the Aorere River, went out to sea. It meant that the mussel farmers couldn't harvest the mussels because they were contaminated with E. coli. So a lot of the dairy farmers planted up the stream banks. It stopped a lot of the pollution running over the land into the Aorere and out to sea, and it meant that the mussel farmers were able to harvest after more significant rain events than they had been able to previously. We need to recognise that connection, and we need to improve what we do on land. Our oceans need a break, and I'll go on now just to talk about some of the reasons why they need a break and how we can give them a bit of a break. So one of the critical things is that healthy oceans are definitely a treaty issue. Māori have a genealogical connection to the oceans. They're descendants of Tangaroa, the god of the sea, and that role of being kaitiaki is really strongly embedded in the Te Ao Māori perspective. And Māori, hugely skilled navigators. When Cook came to Aotearoa, Te Paia was one of the key guides, really skilled in celestial navigation. So that whole perspective of Te Ao Māori is really critical in how we weave and create a new future for our oceans. And then in New Zealand, in 1992, there was a big fisheries settlement which led to Māori through Te Ahu Kaimoana getting a major share of the commercial fishery and commercial fishing quota. So they're actively involved in commercial fishing. Now I'll skip over plastic bags because you've heard quite a lot of that in workshops yesterday. And you probably found, did anyone find any plastic shopping bags on the beach this morning? How many? 2. Did you find one as well? Okay. Well, when people used to do beach cleanups, before we banned the single-use plastic shopping bags, they were quite frequently found in our beach cleanups. And that is one thing, the power of the people. So many schools, communities around Aotearoa said to government, we want to ban single-use plastic shopping bags because they're light, they're only used for probably less than 10 minutes, then they often get thrown away, they end up in rivers, they end up in stormwater systems, they were ending up in the oceans. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and I in 2017 got more letters asking us to ban single-use plastic shopping bags than virtually anything else. So when I, as Associate Environment Minister, said to the Ministry for the Environment, we want to ban them, the officials said, well, they're not a very major part of the waste stream. It's not really very important to do that. But that campaign that people did convince government, convince ministers, so we directed the ministry to go about banning them. So we now have, and it has meant a lot less of those bags ending up on beaches because there are much fewer of them in circulation. And it's just natural now that people take their own shopping bags to wherever you buy your groceries, whether it's at the supermarket or at farmers markets and the like. We change there. So governments have got a major responsibility to make it easy for people to do the right thing. We banned microbeads last term, and David Parker's continuing some work I've started to ban plastic tableware, expanded polystyrene, which is often used for coffee cups or in takeaway packaging. There's a container return scheme being developed for beverage containers, glass bottles, tin cans, so that you'll get something back, 10, 20 cents when you return them, if government signs that off. Recycling systems across the country are being standardised so that it makes it easier to recycle. And you contributed this morning to getting better data on what ends up on our beaches. By knowing that, we can go back up the chain and work out what we have to change in the manufacture, design and sale of products to stop them ending up in the oceans. And the major thing we did was increase the landfill levy so that there is an economic incentive to stop putting waste into landfill. And now government's going to go and review the Waste Minimisation Act, so some more change there. So we're doing things to change and reduce the amount of plastic getting into the oceans, but one thing about the oceans is we haven't protected very much of it. Does anyone know what extent of protected areas we have on land in our national parks and our reserves? It's 30%. So a third of Aotearoa New Zealand on land is protected. And there are controls on mining, on bulldozing, on felling trees. How much of our sea space in Aotearoa and around Aotearoa is protected? 0.4%. So that's tiny. So in the oceans, because they are so large, there's been this view that they're infinite and we can continue to exploit them without setting aside very many protected areas. So there are 44 marine reserves around Aotearoa. Here in Canterbury, there's a tiny one at Pohatu Bay on Banks Peninsula, and about 10% of Wakaroa Harbour is protected at Dan Rogers. And getting that reserve, because I was involved in the campaign, took over 12 years. It is so hard to do marine protection at sea, and yet we've done it on land. Why can't we do it at sea? There are people all over Aotearoa who are standing up for more marine protection. This is Sue Noroita of the Noises Trust and Otatata, which is part of the Noises group, which is near Motatapu and Rangitoto in the Hauraki Gulf. On land, they've got things like giant weta, the tieki, the saddleback, a lot of lizards, and it's really abundant because of predator control. But underneath the water, you've got what's called kina barrens. Has anyone talked about those yesterday? Okay, so that's a snapper. We don't really get them down here, but there are a lot of them in the Hauraki Gulf. That's a big snapper. So its jaws are big enough to eat the kina. What happens when you get too much fishing? Any thoughts? Yeah, so we don't get any more big snapper. So the big snapper aren't there. So the kina flourish because they're not being eaten. And what do the kina eat? They eat kelp. So they are eating up the kelp forests, which is a critical habitat for fish and marine invertebrates. So we really need an ecosystem in balance, which has a lot more big snapper in it to keep the kina under control. And so that's one of the key things in the Hauraki Gulf, to have more marine protected areas to reduce the fishing pressure, both commercial and recreational, so that we can have species like those big snapper so we can get the ecosystem back in balance. So today, a lot of the Hauraki Gulf looks like the left, very few fish, a lot of kina, but with marine protection, with controls on fishing, we can have the abundance returned. And marine protected areas, as all the research in marine reserves has shown, are one way to increase that abundance. So just talk very briefly about commercial fishing. This is a smaller inshore trawling vessel, and we have in New Zealand quite a lot of lack of trust really in the whole fishing sector. The Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, Juliette Gerard, recently did a big report on commercial fishing. I think she said it was one of the most difficult things she had done in her life, because you've got the environmental organisations like Greenpeace and Forest and Bird, WWF, and the commercial fishers at loggerheads. MPI, which is supposed to regulate fishing, isn't trusted by either the industry or the NGOs. So it's a very low trust environment. And it's an environment too where the regulator, Fisheries New Zealand, which is part of the Ministry of Primary Industries, has really been captured by the fishing industry. So if you're interested, have a look at the PMSCA website where Juliette Gerard's report is. She was suggesting that government put in place a strategic action plan for the oceans, and David Parker is the Oceans and Fisheries Minister, and he has committed to actually looking at that plan, looking at her recommendations and reports seriously and considering recommendations. One of the critical things she said was that with fishing, we need to take an ecosystem-based approach. not just think about the fish and how we manage fish, but look at fish in the context of the whole marine ecosystem. Because there's so much we don't know. A third of the fish that are caught commercially are from fish stocks that haven't been properly assessed, so we don't really know how abundant they are. And so there's a lot of work that's needed in that science space, and a lot of work that's needed to recognise the science that is done by universities as well as by the fishing industry. So that was an inshore trawler. These are the big vessels that fish off the coast in the EEZ. And one of the really high impact methods of fishing is something called bottom trawling, which you probably haven't heard of. So this is just a diagram. Bottom trawling is incredibly destructive because they have these steel or heavy plastic rollers, big heavy chains, which are on the bottom of the net. They weight it down. Then they have these things called trawl doors, which keep the the net wide open. And so the net just gets dragged along the bottom. So what happens if you drag a heavy weighted line with these steel rollers, big steel chains, and some of the fishing vessels can have 2 of these doing it in a pair, and I've even seen diagrams of 3. So dragging these big lines and big nets across the seabed crushes everything in its path. And the seabed's not all just sand or sediment. Often in New Zealand waters, it's got things like beds of shellfish or deep water corals, cold water corals, and it only takes a couple of passes of these nets for everything to be crushed to rubble. So you're getting major habitat destruction there, and the research that's been done will show that there's no signs of recovery even 10, 15 years after this has happened. So there is a big push to stop bottom trawling because it is effectively bulldozing the seabed. And the Deep Sea Ocean Coalition got together a big petition, again, people speaking out, saying to government, you need to take action here and stop bottom trawling. Because we have in our waters big underwater mountains called seamounts. Some of them are as big as Aoraki Mount Cook, our highest mountain on land. Because the currents are pushed upwards and you get a lot of nutrients coming up, these underwater mountains or seamounts are a hotspot for biodiversity. They're where species like orange ruffy spawn. So if you get these nets being dragged over them, they crush all the corals and they destroy these biodiversity hotspots. So in places like Chile, they banned bottom trawling on seamounts in 2015. The European Union did it in the seas off Spain and Portugal in 2005. But here in Aotearoa, 48% of our underwater mountains are still open to bottom trawling. So the Green Party is saying, and a lot of the environmental NGOs are saying, we need to stop bottom trawling, and we need to stop bottom trawling on seamounts as a priority. So if you want to eat fish, would thoroughly recommend Forest and Bird's Best Fish Guide, because it highlights which fish are not sustainable in terms of the fishing practices and which fish are under the most threat. Species like orange ruffy are in the red category because bottom trawling is the major technique used to catch them, cardinal fish, oreo, and species like that. So the Best Fish Guide lets you make a more informed choice. One of the things where government has undertaken quite major change is when last term we reviewed the threat management plan for Maui and Hector's dolphin. Got about 15,000 Hector's dolphin left in Aotearoa, mainly around the South Island. Banks Peninsula is one of their strongholds, as is the West Coast. Too many dolphins were being caught in set nets. They're mammals, they need oxygen to breathe, they get caught in a net, they can't rise up to the surface and breathe, and they drown. They're the world's smallest dolphin, and the Maui dolphin is one of the world's rarest. So there was, again, major pressure through the submission process. I think there was a petition with 78,000 signatures, 15,000 submissions. I knew as Minister of Conservation we needed to do much more for Hector's dolphin and Maui dolphin. So we doubled the size of the area that was off limits to set netting and to trawling. Increased the size of the Banks Peninsula Sanctuary, extended it all the way down to Timaru, increased the size of the sanctuary off the Taranaki coast as well, so that there are safer havens for these dolphins where they're not at the risk of being caught in set nets. And we did things like banned seismic surveying in the sanctuaries because, funnily enough, you'd had these marine mammal sanctuaries where seismic surveys could proceed with all the impacts that has in terms of acoustic disturbance, and where seabed mining could proceed. So we banned that within the sanctuaries as well. But just coming quickly to the end, seabird conservation. What people don't realise is that thousands of seabirds get hooked on fishing lines or caught in nets each year. This is the Antipodean albatross. There are only about 3,000 breeding pairs off an island down to the east of New Zealand, southeast of New Zealand. They, because of changing climate, it's thought, and also because of overfishing, fish are scarcer and the birds are diving often to get the bait that is on the hooks on the long lines and then getting caught on those hooks, dragged in and drowned. So in Budget SEP 2018, deliberately increased the funding for DOC so that it could have more fisheries observers that worked with the vessels, their captains, to make sure they have these orange, red Tory lines to help avoid the fish being caught in the warp lines, and that they are using more techniques like, though this is plastic, in the fish's hand there. You can, whoops, wrong way, sorry. You can see the hook pod. So that's a little plastic shield that goes over the hook, and it protects it prevents the bird from grasping the hook until it's released under the water deeper than the diving depth of the albatross. So there's also experimentation going on with how you set the hooks and lines directly off the boat, pushing them down to 10 metres or more deep so that the birds can't get them. But we've got a long way to go to stop the thousands of seabirds that are dying. And also you can see from the work that's done where they put a little tracking device on the birds that this is New Zealand here, these birds can fly and forage all the way to the coast of Chile. So it's not just what we do in New Zealand waters that's important. We need to cooperate with other countries, which is why we signed an agreement with Chile to do this in 2019. And there's a big international convention on protecting migratory species where the Department of Conservation and MFAT have been advocating for more work to protect albatross as well. Does anyone know what these are, the little holes in the forest floor? They are taiko burrows. So a lot of our farming today is using the wealth in our soils, which comes from having millions of seabirds nesting on headlands around Aotearoa. We don't have those millions of seabirds nesting on the mainlands now. This is on Rangatira, or Southeast Island, as part of the Chatham's group, Rakohu, which is about 800 kilometres to the east of Otatahi, Christchurch. So these little guys, Chatham Islands petrel, nest in these burrows. And I guess what is happening in terms of seabird conservation, there's the work that needs to be done at sea, but there's also enormously dedicated effort by the Department of Conservation and ornithologists and iwi and others. There were 30 breeding pairs of these birds in the 1980s. Now there are close to 2,000 individuals. And that's been because of a huge amount of effort put into predator control, both on Main Chatham to prevent mice and things going over to Rangatira, and translocating birds onto Main Chatham and Pitt to establish new colonies. And just a massive amount of research to actually build that population up from 30 breeding pairs to over 2,000. And similarly on the Chathams, there's a lot of work being done with the Chatham Island albatross, or mollymawk. Its breeding was restricted to just one very steep rock stack called the Pyramid, or Te Tarakaya Koia. And because on these rock stacks, they're vulnerable to storms. What's happening with the changing climate, we're getting more storm events. that would take away the vegetation. That would mean the birds, when they laid their eggs, if there's not the vegetation there, the eggs tend to break on the open rock. And so it meant that they were not breeding at all successfully. So with that in mind, a group of locals has sought to establish a new colony on main Chatham Island. And this is a place called The Gap. And it's some landowners, Liz and Bruce Tuanui. They set up the Taiko Trust, which also works with taiko, petrel species. They've got this huge fence, and they are doing a lot of planting inside the fence and trying to re-establish Chatham Island forget-me-nots, and also going out to the pyramid, taking some of the young chicks, bringing them back and establishing them in these flower pots, which apparently the chicks are quite happy with because they resemble their built-up nests on the pyramid. And then a small team of volunteers, they shifted about 300 chicks between 2014 and 2018. And then they had, this is not, this is on the Chathams, right? 800 kilometres away. So organising all of this and the supplies, you've got to order them from mainland New Zealand. Then this team worked with a group of fishers to feed these little chicks, and they were being fed every day about 60 kilograms for all of the chicks of squid, fish oil, which all had to be warmed up because birds don't like cold food because they're eating live food, fed to them for several months until they, that's a decoy in the background, until they were, to make them feel at home, until they were big enough. And then these birds go off and they don't come back to land again for about 5 to 6 years. So they don't even know whether they've been successful. But to me, this just highlights the huge commitment that people are making to giving our threatened species a better chance, and the many different ways that people can get involved, whether it's pressuring government to change a threat management plan to ban single-use plastic bags, or whether it is getting involved through biology and ecology, doing the censuses of these birds, helping with the relocation, the volunteers who are helping with the planting, the fencing, the predator control outside the fence, and they did a big effort inside the fence, and then the feeding of these individual birds to establish a second colony to give them a better chance if anything happens on the pyramid. So that's just one example of a lot of the mahi that's happening in the conservation space by people who are really intent on making a difference and ensuring that the species with whom we share these islands of Aotearoa have a fighting chance, or an even more than fighting chance, at survival. So there's an awful lot that we can still explore and learn about the oceans, amazing array of species out there, and a lot that we need to do here on land to ensure the health of our oceans, and a lot that we need to change in the commercial fishing, recreational fishing space to ensure that there is enough kai for other species, and also so that the food webs are back in a healthy state. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, kia ora. Happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you. And the politician gave like the happy, uplifting talk. How cool is that? There's going to be a load of questions. Where's the microphone gone? Did we lose it? Did someone eat it?
Oh, here it is. Here's one.
Oh, look at that. See, that's why you're in charge of running the country, because you know where microphones are.
I was just wondering what you think the best way young people like us can affect, what's going on in the government, and how we can make the biggest difference for the environment.
Really good question. I mean, the school strike for climate was a really strong reminder that government needs to speed up the action. And it's following your passion and getting involved with a group of other people doing something about an issue that you care about. I didn't intend to go into politics. I did a law degree and a history degree and a bit of journalism. But whether you like designing stuff, that means you can design products that here at the School of Engineering that like bioplastics that are made of cellulose instead of fossil fuel plastics. Whether you like sort of art and you want to connect with a bigger audience. So it's following your passion on an issue that you care about and working with others, because one person alone doesn't really make a difference. With plastic bags, it was a lot of people writing, because governments tend to follow what the public wants. Governments don't often lead, it's they follow. And the same with the Hector's dolphin. There've been people campaigning to protect Hector's dolphin because of the strength of the fishing industry for years. And finally, with the review of that plan, it's still not enough. But again, it was people saying, we want this done. And it's the same on any issue. It's people wanting change. On bottom trawling, that petition that 52,000 people have signed to stop bottom trawling, we're going to hear that at the Select Committee. And it's already meant that the Ministry of Primary Industries has got a little working group going on what are the impacts of bottom trawling. So they've begun to see the writing on the wall that there needs to be some change. So get involved with an issue you care about and work with others. And you can't change everything. So just, it all makes a difference. It really does.
I guess my question was that you were speaking earlier about the Ministry of the Environment was sort of wasn't wanting you to change the plastic bag rules, and then the fishing industry was against changes. Do you have quite a lot of opposition from industry and government officials to changes that you want to make?
Another really good question, because we came in 2017 and we had 9 years of a national government. So the public service has to be objective, but they were so used to a national government that the ministry had a very small team. There were 9 people in the waste team. There hadn't been any change under national, because the legislation to minimise waste, it was actually a Green Party member's bill by Nandor Tanjos about 10 years before, but the tools in it hadn't been used. So I came along wanting change because we had a big problem. And it was just a sense of everything was so slow. But then once the public service, the ministry realised, we've got a different government. They want to do stuff. And that seriously took about 18 months. Then the team really geared up and they started putting a lot of papers together and a lot of ideas. And I also, through Grant Robertson and the budget process, got more money, so they got more staff. And now the ministry is one of the fastest growing agencies in government. So now they are doing the thinking and coming out with the policy papers. But it did take a while to change. And with the fishing industry, with New Zealand First, there were a lot of suggestions that the big donations the fishing industry made to New Zealand First, because everything had to be agreed with New Zealand First because it was 3 parties in government, we found it really hard. And there was a discussion paper on more marine protected areas, which was one of the things I wanted to release, and we couldn't get that out. So governments and the political parties in power make a difference. So your vote counts. So you do have to vote as well. But I think there's a lot more focus now on commercial fishing. When I was an activist before I became an MP, we were focusing on logging and what was happening on land. And now a lot of the NGOs are focusing onto the oceans. So there's more attention and there's been change in fisheries, but it does take a while. Yeah.
There's one at the back, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You were talking about implementing more marine reserves within the plan. And I was just wondering, like in an ideal world, we could just do it everywhere and it'd be great. But that's not true. And we need to sort of maximise and get our bang for our buck. And I was just wondering, like in your professional opinion, what you think that means for us if we want to be selective and be actively choosing the most important things? Like, is that size, is that location, is that shape? What does that look like to you?
So the Marine Reserves Act dates back to 1971, and the main reason for establishing marine reserves under that act is for scientific research. That was where the Lee Goat Island one was first established. So DOC has done a discussion paper with a lot of discussion with Te Oho Kaimoana, Māori Fisheries, and Fisheries New Zealand. We need to change the legislation. We need a greater variety of marine protected areas, not just for scientific purposes, to protect underwater seascapes. And one of the recommendations Juliet Gerard, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, made was we need to use the tools in the Fisheries Act, which allow habitats that are important for fisheries, like spawning areas, to be protected. At the moment, they're not. So that's a tool. And then Doc has done quite a lot of scientific publications, probably with folk from University of Canterbury and elsewhere, about the criteria for marine protection, getting a representative and viable network. And we also need reserves that might change in time. Like in the Taranaki Bight, there are big krill upwellings there. So you see a lot of marine mammals there at certain times of the year when there are a lot of krill. So maybe there's no fishing there for the times of the year when the krill are there, and then you can fish later. So we need to learn from some of the overseas examples. We need to change the legislation and then use these criteria to actually, the scientific criteria, to get the scientists to identify the places that are best, and also iwi Māori in terms of mana whenua, identifying important areas for mahinga mataitai, kaiapure, and using customary tools for those. So that's based on the science, I think, and cultural. I see somebody nodding in the front row.
Cheers. My question was, if we're able to ban bottom trawling in New Zealand, how are we able to, because the ocean's so vast and so far out, how can you manage people stopping that and abiding by these rules?
There's been a big campaign to put cameras on fishing boats because the tech's there. I mean, you think of the GoPro cameras, well, they're a bit more sophisticated than that. But the fishing industry has been really reluctant because they don't want all of this information held, and then particularly NGOs being able to go through it and see the seabirds that are being caught, the other species that are being caught. But David Parker recently announced that cameras are going on boats. Some have gone on the Maui dolphin trawl fleet already because they've been the priority in terms of preventing catches of, well, not, they won't prevent the catches, but they'll make sure there's better observing. Deep water boats have observers on them, but they can't be ever vigilant. That's why we need cameras. And also GPS has, a lot of boats have good GPS because the fishing companies want to know where their fishing boats go so they can track them, which is why there was one, I can see Tim's wanting me to wind up. One vessel which went into one of the tiny marine reserves on the Kaikoura coast. You'd think in this day of electronic charts that would be, they wouldn't do that. So cameras on boats, more observers, and use of the GPS system, and Fisheries New Zealand having more staff doing compliance and enforcement, so doing sort of monitoring that tracking information. Yeah. There's still quite a lot of work to do in terms of all the images that come back from cameras on boats, those cameras, using artificial intelligence to then detect what is being landed and whether it is seabirds that are being caught or, so there's quite a lot of research happening in that space too. Yeah. Kia ora.
Is shipping and the cruise ship industry, do they disrupt our marine environment a lot?
Another great question. Have seen photos down at, has anyone been to Milford Sound, Piotahi? Yeah, so you imagine Milford Sound with a big cruise ship in it, belching diesel. It's a bit at odds with the peace, the drama of the seascape, landscape that people go down there for. So there's, and in Akaroa Harbour, when they didn't have the cruise berth in Littleton, you'd have sometimes two big cruise ships there, which was overwhelming the harbour, stirring up a lot of the sediment when they put their thrusters on to leave. But in the Hauraki Gulf, there's been, now Steve, is it Bridie's or Brooder's whale? Thank you, Riley. Thank you, Steve. Brooder's whale are found in the Hauraki Gulf, and there were too many collisions with vessels. So there was a lot of discussion, and then the ships slow down as they come through the Gulf, and that's reduced the collisions with Brooder's whale. So you do need to engage with the industry there, and that's work there. So with the cruise ships, they're generally going reasonably slowly. It's just, they overwhelm smaller places, I think, but it's more seismic surveys with these big underwater arrays of compressed air where they're doing seismic surveys of the seabed to find minerals. The acoustic disturbance from that is huge. And I think there was some work done during the lockdown overseas which showed a lot more fish and marine mammals going back into areas when the boat traffic wasn't there because of the lockdown. So yeah, that noise And we need to do more just in terms of the impacts of acoustic noise, like even just fizz boats and things. So, yeah. How many more questions we got time for?
One more.
Okay, well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much.